evening. I'm Melisa Idris. When we think about poverty, we often imagine people or households under a certain income threshold. But poverty is far more complex than that. It cuts across health, education, living standards. And this is where the Multidimensional Poverty Index can help shed light on these overlapping deprivations. So what does it take to tackle poverty in all its forms? Well, the question is also, are we making enough progress when it comes to tackling multidimensional poverty? Joining me on the show today is Professor Dr Sabina Alkire, who has spent her career redefining how we understand and measure poverty. She's the director of the Oxford Poverty and Human Development Initiative. Together with Professor James Foster, she developed the Alkire-Foster method for measuring multidimensional poverty. And she's in town today as a speaker for Forum Economy Malaysia 2025 here at KL Convention Centre. Professor Alkire, Sabina, thank you so much for being on the show with me today. So let's talk a little bit about the Multidimensional Poverty Index. It has essentially shifted the way we understand and tackle poverty, when once all we had was this measurement of in monetary terms. So maybe you can begin our conversation today and explain to us a little bit about the MPI. How does it reveal all these different hidden dimensions of poverty that income measures may miss?
Yes, no, as you rightly said, people are used to thinking about poverty in monetary terms. But when you talk with impoverished people, communities, people with disadvantages and deprivations, what strikes you is that their lives are diminished and battered in different ways. It might be somebody in their household is stunted. It might be there's a lack of a job, a lack of a good house, or a very crowded house. It might be that they don't have opportunities to access the internet, or that transport is very challenging. And it's this nexus of overlapping deprivations which defines their poverty. And Amartya Sen refers to that as multidimensional poverty. And so trying to advance his work, we ask, how do you measure it? And the first step is, of course, to see what the protagonists, poor people in their communities, understand poverty to be, to learn from them. They are the experts. And then the second is to try to align that with national development plans, public priorities, and see what indicators and dimensions would reflect poverty in a different context. And we work on two kinds of MPIs, ones that you can compare across all countries, and ones that are really tailored to the national contexts. And here in Malaysia, the focus is really on a national MPI tailored to the context of Malaysia. But perhaps the best known measure is a measure that's not appropriate for Malaysia because it measures acute poverty, really difficult conditions of poverty in sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia. And this global MPI is an example of a structure that is adapted in different countries. So the global MPI of acute multidimensional poverty has 3 dimensions and 10 indicators. And it's health, education, and living standard. And what you do is you ask each person or household, do you experience this deprivation or not of each of the 10 indicators? And they say yes or no. And this is done with household surveys across the world. So for example, is anybody in your household undernourished? Has very sadly a child perished in the last 5 years? Anybody under the age of 18? Is there any child who is school-aged but not going to school up to the age at which they would complete class 8? Is there nobody in the household who has completed even 6 years of schooling, not a child, not an adult? So those are deprivations in health and education. And in living standard, do you have clean cooking fuel, adequate sanitation, good drinking water within a half an hour's walk? Is your house built of sturdy materials? Do you have access to electricity? And do you have at least 2 of the following assets: a radio, a telephone, a TV, a refrigerator, a bicycle, a motorcycle, a computer, an animal cart? And if you have a car or a truck, you're not deprived in assets. So a multidimensional poverty index starts with each person or household. Are you deprived in each of these 10 indicators? And if you have a critical mass of deprivations, more than 1/3 of the weighted indicators, then you're identified as poor. And so an MPI can say what percentage of the population are poor multidimensionally, just like we talk about what percentage of the population are poor in monetary terms. But it can go beyond that, because at the country level or for different groups, it can say, how intense is the poverty? You know, in the rural areas, maybe there are more deprivations happening on average than in urban areas. And then it can say, for policymakers who say, okay, I want to address this, I want to tackle it, then it can say, well, in the north, nutrition and housing are big problems, and in the south, it's no years of schooling, and it's assets, and it's something else. So you can see how the face of poverty changes, so you know where to invest efforts to really make a shift in levels of poverty.
Regional differences down to that even. I want to talk about the global MPI. So let's talk about when the most recent, so the Global Multidimensional Poverty Index was launched by UNDP and OFI in 2010, if I'm not mistaken. So that's coming on to 15 years now. Sabina, what have you observed when it comes to the changes and the trends over time when it comes to multidimensional poverty? Are there key observations?
Yes, I'd like to start with a positive message. Sometimes when we think of poverty, we feel guilty and we feel depressed. We feel there's always poverty and we're not doing anything about it. And we should, but also the numbers don't change. And so there's often a resistance to talking about poverty. In the case of the MPI, we cover in 2024 112 countries, 6.3 billion people. And we look at trends over time for 86 countries and about 6 billion people. And in 76 of those countries, there's been a statistically significant decline in at least one period. And in 30 of those countries, at some point, poverty was cut by half. And so it's not the case that you can't reduce poverty. It's not the case that you can't reduce poverty a lot. For example, India, from 2005-06 to 2019-21, 415 million people exited poverty. In 2005-06, 55% of the population of India were poor. Now it's 16.4%. So that's a historic shift. And it shows you don't have to have a perfect government. You don't have to have humongous resources, even high income levels, in order to really make a big change in poor people's lives. And in the region, for example, Cambodia, in the 7.5 years that spanned the pandemic, cut poverty by half. And so it's certainly possible, and it's possible with different starting levels of poverty. Cambodia's was much lower, but it still came down very well. So I guess what the first message is that a multidimensional poverty measure changes when any deprivation of any poor person goes down. So if you have a government program of school feeding, so children go to school and nutrition comes down, then that year the MPI changes. If you think of monetary poverty, the child is well nourished, monetary poverty doesn't change. The child completes 5th class, monetary poverty change for years. And so the MPI is sort of a immediate finger on the pulse kind of measure of the accuracy of service delivery and infrastructure development and the outcomes that really matter.
So the last year, so 2024 Global MPI report was titled Poverty Amid Conflict, and I thought that was quite interesting to look at how poverty and conflict intersect.
Yeah.
What were some of the findings from that report? What does that mean when poor people are living through conflict, times of conflict? What does that mean for poverty reduction in a country, for instance?
Yeah. I mean, intuitively, we know that conflict exacerbates poverty. It destroys infrastructure. People can't go to health clinics. They can't go to schools. Maybe they're bombed. Maybe they're devastated. And so we know that there are associations. And we suspect that as well, if there are impoverished people and situations of desperation and not another space of constructive change, then poverty might also create conditions of conflict. But we've never done a measurement of multidimensional poverty and conflict.
Oh, was this the first time?
So this is the first time.
Wow.
And we used 3 different approaches to measuring conflict. One, which we used consistently, was the Uppsala Conflict Data Program. Another was the World Bank's Conflict and Fragility, Fragile and Conflict-Affected Situations measure. And the third was the Global Peace Index that measures very low peacefulness up to high peacefulness. And this year we looked at poverty for 6.3 billion people, and 1.1 billion were living in poverty. And we found that 40% of those 4 people lived in situations of conflict. And it was a lot higher than I thought when we said we're going to do this. But 40% wake up in a country that's 1, 2, or 3 of those situations. Either it's in conflict in terms of battle deaths, or fragility, or very low or low peacefulness. And so that was a little bit of a sobering reminder that it's not just that you're dealing, and remember, this is acute poverty. This is not sort of Malaysia's level of poverty. This is really acute poverty, and on top of that, there's this insecurity. Then we looked at what are the levels of poverty in situations of conflict or non-conflict. And we found that in all 3 of the measures that we used, it was much higher. So for example, using the Uppsala Conflict Data Program, it was 3 times higher, the level of poverty in situations of conflict. But in the other 2 as well, it was nearly that. And so that's saying that it's not only that a lot of people are conflict affected, but the poorest are in conflict settings. And then we looked at trends. We said, well, maybe, what happens during a conflict? And we didn't have data of the same periods as conflicts in many countries. So we can't generalize. But of the countries where we looked at trends, we found that it was slower. That there was poverty reduction, but it was a lot slower than in non-conflict affected countries.
What do we do with this knowledge, knowing how much conflict exacerbates poverty?
I think one is to put on the table, and in a way that I hope that Malaysia will be a leading voice for, the importance of poverty. I am in this work because it's intrinsically valuable. We all support it for ethical reasons, for humane reasons. These people have imagination, possibilities, creativity, and skills, and they need to develop them to be able to use them, flourish, and serve the society. But also there's a sobering reality that if there is poverty, then that can be a condition for conflict, and that conflict also can then peel back the possibilities people have to contribute to their societies. And so I think, like the Global Alliance Against Hunger and Poverty that Brazil led and that Malaysia has joined, like other initiatives, we need to really speak about poverty in international fora. And so often people don't want to. They want to talk about growth or digital tech transformations, and poverty seems embarrassing and out of date. You can use another word, deprivation, inequality, but there needs to be a concern for those who are at the bottom of the distribution, and really making sure that their lives get better.
That is an interesting observation about how poverty may have been put on the back burner when it comes to the public discourse, or when we talk about the poverty reduction agenda. Has that been your observation over the years? Have we found it less sexy to talk about alleviating or reducing poverty? How do we get it back onto the public agenda?
Well, I'm an academic, and academics are famously impatient, and we move on to the next problem and the next problem, and we get bored by research that we've done in the past. But my mentor was Amartya Sen, and Amartya Sen still teaches at Harvard at his great age of 91. But he would talk about basic education and child undernutrition. It was no longer intellectually interesting, but the problem wasn't solved. And so he said, we have to keep talking about these things. And I think that creating an ethos where whether we are in academia, whether we are in policy, we don't get bored by poverty and move on to the next thing that we think is more, where there's money, where there's a fad, where there's visibility, but we say that the ongoing core, the heartbeat of our work, one part of it will always be a concern for leaving no one behind, and for investing in their lives and being in solidarity with them.
You talk about that's the role of academia, we talk about the role of the government. Are there roles beyond the government, beyond academia? Are there roles for non-government actors to help in this fight?
Very much so.
Okay.
So I'll begin with the business sector, because it's not one that springs to mind, but in many countries we work in, it's actually become a very committed partner. And CEOs, if they are exposed to the day in, day out living reality, often they say, well, what can we do? And often they can start with their employees and their value chains and just address poverty there, but using the national measure. And so what they do for their national purposes or their business purposes, of course, it's going to improve staff retention, improve staff morale, and this is studied and it's been demonstrated in the countries, but it also contributes to poverty reduction nationally. But NGOs, faith-based groups, for example, faith-based groups often know these people. Right. They know them for years. And that's something that a government program may not. And so they can be a wonderful partner. And they can also, where there are universal programs and people follow through the cracks, then the government wants to know who's falling through the cracks because every citizen should have access to this or that. And these NGOs can bring to the government, this information so they can act. And it's sort of a cost-saving device on both sides. And they can also observe needs that are really important but aren't right now being addressed.
Because they see it, right?
Yeah.
They're there on the ground,
They're
they can see it. So they can also become a conduit for poverty reduction. We talked a little bit about the intersection of poverty and conflict. Talk to me about the intersection of poverty and climate resilience and the climate vulnerability.
Yes. We are hoping at OFI to have this be a theme of a future study.
Oh, good.
In fact, in the near future. So we are working on it quite actively. We don't yet have the results. But what we have observed is that you have geospatial data. And the global MPI, for example, is disaggregated for children, for the elderly, by disability status, by ethnicity, by gender of the household head, by rural-urban area. But we have data for 1,359 subnational regions, and in many countries we have geospatial data of the household. And so we can merge that with satellite data on wildfire, on drought, on flood, on air precipitate quality, on earthquake, on cyclone, and we can see where the poor people, in the same year in which they experienced poverty, were also being battered by disasters, by climate conditions. So for example, in Madagascar, we looked over a 10-year period of time at poverty and at climate disasters, 5 of them. And 9 of the 10 provinces that were poorest in poverty terms were the most struck by environmental concerns. Madagascar is just a wonderful beacon of biodiversity, but it has the fastest forest loss in the world. And it's a place to really be concerned about. And I think documenting that means that these are not either or. We need to be able to address them together.
So similar to the report on overlaying conflict data, you could now overlay geospatial climate data as well.
Yes.
We could use that to help the people who are affected the most by the climate crisis.
Yeah, I think that's important to see.
Talk to me about the needed policy interventions for this. You made references to several countries who have seen success in reducing poverty. What did they get right in their work? And how long did it take without losing hope that this is fighting a losing battle?
So I'm going to start with something that sounds boring but isn't. So data sounds very boring. It's not something anybody gets up in the morning saying, I want to do this. But actually, if you think of poverty reduction, you want to have an incentive. You want to motivate people. And if you're doing a lot of work and then there's 5 years before you have an update of your results, you get bored. You don't have a feel-good, you don't know if it's been effective. Your boss never says, well done. And the countries that have reduced poverty a lot have frequent data on poverty. In terms of national MPIs, for example, Vietnam or Thailand, they update their MPI every year, every 2 years. Colombia, Ecuador, Armenia, South Africa, they have frequent data. And that's an important part of their journey because then they know what's going right, they know what's going wrong, they reallocate each year to accelerate and bottleneck. And so with a fixed budget, you can get poverty down faster than if you have data every 5 years and maybe you've been making a mistake for 5 years and you don't know it. So that's boring, but it's essential.
So they prioritize data.
Yeah. Okay. The second is leadership. And it doesn't have to be the head of state, though sometimes it is the president or the vice president or the prime minister. But really where people are committed and hook up with each other. They can be a junior staff person, but we see that they are able to make change, to make ripples. And I can't say enough because all of us can do that. That's something we can do from where we stand. I could give lots of stories. But then it's really having a good match between the evidence of how people are poor and what's happening. So for example, in India, in the most recent data set, 230 million people are poor. And 15% of the poor people, 34 million, have exactly 4 deprivations: nutrition, housing, sanitation, and cooking fuel.
The exact same 4?
Yeah, the exact same 4, 34 million people. But at that point, there was no government program that addressed all of them together. And so here's some data that's actually actionable. You can say, okay, I could get 34 million people out if we focus on these. And so it's finding ways that data on multidimensional poverty is just, you know, then you can put it out there and you say, okay, this is how we're going to save money and really change lives. Instead of, you know, just blanketing with interventions that might be excessive. They're not really needed.
You've made data sound so interesting and important now. When we think about how tools like the MPI are used to achieve a reduction in poverty, do you see it evolving? Is this what other ways can it be applied to? It's a tool, so are there innovative ways that you see it evolving in the future? I mean, is there a vision for how it can help achieve that goal faster?
Yes, I'll give 3 quickly.
Oh, good.
One is that now individual indicators are gender disaggregated. We look at intra-household patterns, so we can say, are more girls poor and out of school than boys, undernourished than boys, and poor and non-poor. And we can just slice and dice the data by gender, by age, and say, for example, in Pakistan, 22% of the children, over 1 in 5, of children under the age of 5, share their household with another child under the age of 5 who isn't undernourished and they are undernourished. You know, and so you have this situation of intra-household inequalities. And so that's...
And that's gender-driven?
A little bit.
A little bit.
Yeah, but not completely. So those are things that are actionable. Or like 1 in 4 households in South Asia that don't have any educated adult who's completed 6 years of schooling have a young person who has under the age of 17. So it's over 100 million people living in households where the only educated member is a young person. You need to support those young people. So I think the gender angle's one. The second is moderate MPI or well-being measures. So a country like Malaysia doesn't need the acute MPI. We're working with Islamic Development Bank to do a moderate MPI. It would be appropriate for Thailand, Vietnam, Malaysia, Armenia, Albania, Moldova, you know, Chile, these countries where acute poverty is not any longer on the cards. And Bhutan has a well-being measure. So it adds dimensions like relationships, like environment, like psychological well-being of positive, negative emotions, spirituality. And it's the same structure as their MPI. But you can see that some of the poorest districts are also least happy, and some in rural areas are the happiest, because they've got good culture, good relationships, harmony with nature, spirituality. And then you can really have a 360-degree talk about poverty and well-being.
I've got chills when you said that. So, but why is it important? Explain to us why it's important that countries like Malaysia have this type of measure, that it's tailored to these types of nuances.
I think because as well as lifting poverty, you have to look at the overall changes. And if you lift poor people out of poverty, or they exit poverty, but then they lose other things that are really important, like really good quality relationships, harmony with the environment, time to be, you know, then contentment. And you're losing something important. And there's no right or wrong, it's a social conversation, it's a value judgment. But if you don't have data on this, it's hard to ask the values questions. And these can sort of strike them and then have a discussion about really what matters and how shall we change. And the last, to be very, very quick, is, it's just dropped my mind, moderate poverty, gender, and targeting at the household level.
Okay.
So a country like Malaysia, for example, has a fantastic database where they're bringing in administrative data from different sources using the national ID with privacy regulations. And that means that at the household level, you can do a lot of good targeting. And people can get a QR code for exactly, they have a child who's really bright and needs a scholarship, they get a QR code for that. This household has that. And again, it's a very efficient way of supporting families at different points. It has to have privacy It has to have, you know, good, very
robust security. Yes,
but where that is, it's changing our world because we have this interoperability we never had before with data.
Right. Yeah, but the possibilities are endless.
Yeah.
I'm excited now to see what the future holds. But thank you so much, Professor Sabina. Thank you for being on the show with me and for sharing some of your work with us today. I appreciate your time.
Thank you so much.
I'm Melisa Idris signing off for the evening. Thank you so much for watching and good night.